we had like this, typical government like glossy brochure that we were putting out as part of this 100 days thing, and it had, planning funding for this and that and the other thing. And I remember having this meeting with the public servants who were kind of helping us put it together, and we were talking about like, what are we going to call it? And it was, there's all these kind of, classic government kind of names, our whatever, our future, that kind of thing. And we said, no, we want to call it Getting On With It. Like, that is what we are doing. We are getting on with delivering our promises. And that was all a bit kind of confronting for the public servants.
And there must have been a temptation to call one of those papers Getting Shit Done or Motherfuckers On It, that kind of thing.
It was debated on numerous occasions.
The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Thursday on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And this is an episode I've been wanting to do for quite some time. Our guest today was the Chief of Staff to Premier Daniel Andrews for 7 years and totals 14 years of working in Labor governments, Labor oppositions and Labor governments again here in the great state of Victoria, and is now a managing partner at FMRS Advisory, advising CEOs, boards and governments on strategy, social licence and leading change. And she joins the pod for the very first time. Lissie Ratcliff, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you, Stephen. Very nice to be here.
Is this the first interview you have ever given publicly before?
It is. I am both, I'm primarily apprehensive, a little bit excited. So yes, you're getting the world exclusive.
Yeah, right. Why is this the first time you are giving an interview publicly?
Well, there's my general aversion to kind of the spotlight is part of it. But no, the real kind of primary answer to that really is because, as you just said, I've spent, until recently 14 years as a staffer to politicians, and I think I have a pretty firm view that it is our job to support the people who got elected, and they get to be the spokespeople for their party or their government, and it's not our job to do that. It's our job to stay behind the scenes and make sure they've got all the things that they need to help them do their jobs, but it's not our job to be out the front. So I work for the people who did the talking rather than doing it myself.
You're right. And so you're not doing that now. So now you can do some talking.
Yeah, that's the theory anyway. Let's see how I go.
For about 55 minutes. Yeah. Well, no, I'm super excited about you coming on the show today. I guess I want us to talk a lot about your experiences and time working in a pretty successful government, but also using that opportunity to lean into that experience and reflect on more broadly social democratic parties and governments and how they can be successful in their work. So this is going to be a good chat. But before we do that, as always, for someone who's new on the show, I always like to get a bit of a backstory. So we're going to have to do a bit of a walk down memory lane here, Lissie. And my first question really is, what moments as a young person shaped the person that you are today?
Well, I think maybe if I kind of lean into the context of what we're going to talk about, if you ask my parents that question, they'd probably say I had a fairly precocious sense of what was fair and what wasn't fair, even when I was a little kid, and got fairly unhappy about things that I didn't think were fair. And so that was sort of part of our, I guess, the way we grew up, and I give them and my grandparents a lot of credit for sort of instilling that in us. But also like the news was always on in our house and so one of my earliest memories, ABC radio going all the time. Like my dad watched 3 different news bulletins every night, and then the 7:30 report, and newspapers were always there, books everywhere, and I read everything I get my hands on, and always wanted to kind of know what was going on in the world. Then when I was at school, if we pick out a couple of moments that probably make it fairly obvious in the end where I was going to end up, unbeknownst to me at the time. But, history was my favourite class at school because it was about the closest I could get to politics. I went to a public high school out in the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and we got to year 10 and we didn't have enough kids to warrant having a history class, was what the principal told us. So in my first, I think, proper experience of community organising, I rounded up a bunch of my friends and probably strong-armed a bunch of them who had no interest whatsoever into agreeing that they would do the history class, got enough people to sign the petition and got it back up again. So I guess that's a moment that stands out that I thought, and I think part of what I thought at that time was, I go to a public school out in the middle of, nowhere really. But, why shouldn't we have a history class when everybody else can get one? And then I always sort of liked, how systems worked and kind of making things work behind the scenes, I think. And we got to our year 12, theatre production, and I had no interest whatsoever in being out the front and auditioning for any of the roles on the stage, but I managed to get myself a gig as the assistant stage manager, kind of making everything work behind the scenes, and dealing with all the last minute disasters that always happen with live productions and making sure everything kind of worked the way it was supposed to. So I suppose a couple of little examples there that kind of paid off later in life, that politics and kind of running things behind the scenes was probably always in the cards in some way for me.
It's funny that, isn't it, when you think about those formative moments that you don't realise at the time that, being an assistant backstage production person, making sure everything behind the scenes works, then there can be a formative moment that you'll be then the person behind the scenes to make sure government works.
Well, the principles are the same, last minute costume disasters, last minute cabinet disasters,
Yeah, arguably public cost. Which one's a greater disaster? Who knows? It just is up to the person who's in the middle of the disaster at the time.
Right. That's right.
How did you end up working in politics then? So did you find your way into this crazy world of the Labor Party and the broader movement?
Well, not in probably maybe the traditional pathways for a lot of people that I came to work with later on. But as I said, I'd always been really interested in politics and media. I actually thought for a long time I wanted to be a journalist, which I was later disabused of. But after my first year of uni, I took a year off, and in amongst my hospo jobs, which were very character building, I ended up landing, luckily, a little part-time job with a firm that CPR Communications, which back then was a big national public affairs firm. And it had a lot of former Labor staffers out of the Bracks government working there, a couple of, raving Tories whom I'm still very fond of, and, Labor icon like Robert Ray. And through working with those people, I learnt a lot about communications, about politics, about campaigning, and it was also really the first time I got a sense that you can actually do that work behind the scenes within an institution, within a government, rather than just kind of looking at the outside and kind of commentating on what other people are doing, which is from a journalism perspective where I'd sort of thought maybe I was heading. And through them, I ended up meeting Tim Holding, who was then a senior minister in the then Bracks-Brumby government. And Tim, about a year out from the 2010 election, was looking for a junior advisor to come and set up a social media and online presence for him. You can think back, it feels weird now to say this, but back in 2009, Australian politics wasn't exactly on the cutting edge of social media. I was 24, so obviously I was, absolutely on the cutting edge of these matters. And so, I got the opportunity to go and work for Tim for that last year of that government. And that was my first real experience of organised politics, I guess. So bit unconventional to have come in kind of through the government first rather than through the party, but my family were kind of fellow travellers, Labor voters, but not ever involved in the party, so I kind of hadn't had that experience growing up.
Coming into the government at the tail end after Labor had been in office now since effectively 1999, must have been a weird kind of experience. What did you make of that, and what were the things that you reflect back on in that time that sort of shaped how you wanted to then eventually, when you became the chief of staff, like how you wanted to run a staff or be a player in this campaign, in this world?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting thinking back. I mean, I think back now about how little I knew. I mean, like most 24-year-olds at that point, I thought I was, pretty brilliant. And in retrospect, I knew nothing about, the government or its processes or how it all worked. Happily, that, largely wasn't the bit that I'd been employed for. I think a couple of things I learned from Tim and working in that office particularly, one was that attention to detail in government really, really matters. And, he had a reputation for that. But there was a good lesson that I learnt there that I carried through with me the rest of the time I was a staffer, which was I was careless about something that I was working on for him, and I blew that big time, and he wore the consequences of that publicly. And instead of ejecting me out the nearest window, which he would have been thoroughly within his rights to do, he sort of sat me down and instead told me about his own version of that he'd experienced when he was a staffer many years ago for Robert Ray when he was the Defence Minister. And that kind of really stuck with me, that the detail matters and the consequences. If you're a staffer, the consequences are felt by the people that you work for. And I carried that through with me to the Premier's office, I think sometimes much to the chagrin of the staff who worked in the Premier's office, but that's kind of where that came from. Tim also loved the contest, and that was something that I really learnt in that team, and he treated his staff like part of his tribe. And I think I took that through with me into the other offices that I worked in later when I went to work for Daniel Andrews. And I think taking maybe a step back and up for that government, I should say, like, I was one of the most junior staffers in that government. So the notion that I have some huge, strategic insight into how decisions were being made and all that sort of stuff at the time, like I didn't, absolutely. But I think to their great credit, Daniel and a lot of the senior people who'd been part of that government, who then obviously went into opposition, Daniel particularly, they really drilled into us some of the lessons that they took from it, which was, things like, stakeholders are not the same as voters, and you should campaign on policies, you should campaign on ideas, not on policies. Daniel's got a good reflection about, the epic tome of health policy that he as the health minister put up for the 2010 election, which he said to us, many times afterwards, like nobody read it, nobody voted for it, and it was very meritorious. And in the end, that's not how you win elections. They're about ideas and persuasion. So things like that, and about keeping the caucus, front and centre of your considerations, and understanding where they're at and what they're hearing on the ground and what they need to support their constituents. Like those are the kind of macro lessons, I guess. But I think the thing that probably made the biggest impact on me out of that year that I was there was really, in the end, the visceral experience of losing. Because we weren't expecting to lose that election. I don't think anyone really expected us to lose it. And we did. And that was, obviously I'm sure much more confronting for people who'd been there longer than I had, and who weren't, 24 and kind of generally less concerned about looking after their families than I was. But I think that I always remember when the Monday after the election, the then Premier's Chief of Staff had to put everyone together in Treasury Theatre, and there's a couple hundred of us, and he had to get up there and give a speech in front of all of us, thanking us all for our work and saying that we'd, contributed to something really special and we'd been a good government. And, in this case, it wasn't quite enough in the election. Somebody else was going to have a go. And he was like, that was, a pretty classy kind of thing that he did, and he did it with a lot of grace. And so I always remembered that. And then I also remember that as we all filed out the door afterwards, we all had to hand over our phones and our passes to our offices and all the other stuff. And then it was literally somebody else was going to be moving in the next day, and the Liberal Party took over, and then they went about, taking apart a whole bunch of things that we'd done and making a whole bunch of decisions that we thought were the wrong thing to do. So it's really, it was that whole kind of, I guess, continuing that experience of the loss and how that felt, that really stuck with me, and that later on when I needed it, like that drove me a lot not to repeat that experience.
Sitting in the Treasury Theatre while that was happening, are you thinking, what are you thinking in terms of where you're going next? Did you think that you would, had you had a taste and say, oh, I want to keep doing this? And did you know that it would be in the opposition leader's office, or was it just, I just need to get a job somewhere because there's a whole bunch that's about to lose our jobs, and so therefore it's like a mad scramble to try and find some kind of place somewhere?
Yeah, it is a bit like that. You kind of flood the market with 200 people with similar skill sets all at the same time. It's not exactly ideal. No, sitting there, I didn't know what I was going to do. Like, I was sort of notionally interested in opposition because I'd had a couple of people say to me, like, it's a good experience. You get lots of opportunities to skill up, that kind of thing. But, like, I'd met Daniel Andrews a couple of times in passing, didn't think he knew what my name was. So, I didn't really think that was necessarily going to be a thing. But funnily enough, there was a, farewell drinks kind of thing later on that night. And I remember at one point, someone tapped me on the shoulder, and I sort of turned around and, there he is. Daniel's just been kind of made or he's like, it's clear he's going to be the leader. And he says to me, this is the first time we've ever spoken. And he says to me, you and Lindsay Rayner, who I'd been doing rapid response with during the campaign, which basically involved getting up at 4 a.m. every morning and trawling newspapers. You and Lindsay have been a good team. How would you feel about keeping on doing that in opposition? And I was kind of a bit, wow, yes, I'd love to. Thank you. That'd be amazing. So that is my first ever conversation with Daniel, was him offering me a job.
It's funny how we think about job interviews, these formal moments where we, put on our Sunday best and rock up and prep and stuff. But the Labor Party's not like that. It's these incidental moments in which,
Yeah, pretty much. And I never asked him until in fact, after we'd left government, 13 years later or whatever it was, why he did that. It's funny how these things work.
What did he say?
He said, because I said to him, you didn't even know who I was. And he said, yes, I did. And he said, you worked for Tim. Tim only hired good staff. And so if you'd survived in there, then you knew what you were doing, and you and Lindsay were doing a good job together. So why not? And I was like, all right, sure, there was more to it than that, but fair enough.
So what were the early days of working in opposition? I mean, it's such a change from, you think about the floor space that you have at one Treasury or even in any ministerial office dotted across the sort of Spring Street end of the city, and then you all get lumped into that one floor that's above the flower shop. It's like something out of like a Jean Le Carre novel, the way the office is set up, and the door is hard to find. And so what were those formative moments of setting up that opposition room and being a part of that pretty small knit team?
It was a big change from going from our, level 26, kind of ministerial office with a view out over the city to 157 Spring Street. But it was like setting up it was a total startup organisation, and full credit to the more senior people who kicked it off at the beginning, because again I was one of the juniors at that point. But you're starting everything from scratch. You have no HR processes. You have nothing. You have no resources. The printer doesn't work. You've got getting email set up is hard. You've got to recruit people in, work out what their roles are, work out how to be the opposition. Remembering we'd been in the government for 11 years, so that was a pretty distant memory if any people still had it, and just trying to work out how to. What do we do on a day-to-day basis? So it was I was, one of the Parliament advisors to start with. So, Parliament's the one constant, even though you end up on the other side of the benches. I think opposition's one of those things, lots of people hate it. I loved it, a lot of it. Not to say they weren't hard days, they're hard jobs, but it's straight campaigning basically. And because you've got no resources, there's no public servants, there's no departments to kind of help you do stuff. You just got to DIY literally everything. Mm. And there's opportunities there. If you're willing to work hard and be creative and have a go, then, you can actually, you can get whole campaigns up, or you can go to a shadow minister and say, I think we should have a go at the government about, these planning things they're doing, or, whatever it might be. And they're like, okay, let's go and do that. But the first thing Daniel did when he got elected as the leader was acknowledge that we'd lost and why we'd lost, and that people never get it wrong. And I think that's really important, because I've seen other parties that lose kind of just hang on fighting the fight still, and it's like the war's over, you've got to move on to the next one. So that was done for us on day one. And then in the second year, we kind of we knew we had to get a new agenda. And again, hard after you've been in government for a long time, because you've done so many things, you've got to work out what's next. So, Daniel went off on this listening tour, basically did 100 community forums in, a bit over a year. And that was, anywhere we could get 20 people in a scout hall, or, in a school room somewhere. He'd go and talk to them about, whatever it was that was on their minds. And we got a lot of different ideas out of that. And he got a lot of practice, I think, as well, being, up the front as the leader. I think we did a good job of putting together, to what Daniel had, said to us all those years ago. We put up ideas rather than just policies. And in the end, that was enough to get us over the line, with some pretty relentless campaigning from a very small, very hardworking group of people.
And put up those policies early, though, as well. Like some of the signature announcements that the opposition made were put out 12 months out, which was at the time unheard of. And arguably, we still don't really see that from other oppositions or governments here in Australia. And I think it's something that was unique to certainly the Victorian Labor, was putting out major announcements really early.
Yeah, and I think I'd say, with the benefit of a bit more hindsight on a few more campaign cycles after that, I think we have a tendency in Australian politics and maybe elsewhere to overcorrect on lessons sometimes. But I think in that case, the rationale was, we'd spent 3 years, belting the government every day on, all manner of things like cutting TAFE and our opposition to the East-West Link project, and their performance in ambulance and the health system and other things. And Daniel was really clear that we had to, yes, be critical, yes, hold them to account, yes, do all the scrutiny, but people have a right to say, well, and what are you going to do about it? So what we did in that November 2013, so as you say, 12 months out, we released our big transport policy, and that the centrepiece of that was level crossings, which everybody knows about. But we also, which got a lot less traction at the time, but one of the things that we had in there was we were going to put $300 million on the table to do the planning for what became the Metro Tunnel. And that's, that kind of, I guess, constellation of things to be funded by the long-term lease of the Port of Melbourne, which back then was a pretty controversial thing for the Labor Party to suggest. Like, that said, we were serious. It said we had a real agenda. The level crossings is still one of the great political, it wasn't my idea, but one of the great political campaign promises of all time, because it was across the whole of Melbourne, and there was just something really visceral for people about that ding, ding, ding sound, which everybody understood. So it was one of those things you didn't have to spend a lot of time telling people why that was a good policy. They were like, yeah, that just makes sense.
Funnily enough, though, the media thought it was a joke and, scoffed at the announcement and didn't take it seriously. And that should have been a fucking warning sign for them in terms of how they could misjudge this government consistently then for the next 10, however many years.
Wasn't the last time.
No, exactly. You and I first met properly in around 2012, 2013, and I think it actually was when I was appointed Assistant Secretary of the party and was on campaign committee. And through us kind of getting to know each other during campaign committee and after campaign committee and doing sort of post-campaign committee conversations. And for those who the campaign committee basically is a body that is elected or appointed out of the Victorian Labor Party's administrative committee, which is kind of like the board of the party that operates between the conferences. And so it's very heavily factional, and often the people that are on there, I don't even think it exists anymore, but the people that are on there can be a little less experienced in the world of campaigns, is probably the most diplomatic way I could say it. Anyway, and you and I are looking at each other going, what frontier gibberish are these people talking? That's my words, not yours, Lissie. Anyway, and I said to you, look, I actually, I kind of want to go back over to the States and just annoy some people about some questions that I have in my head about field organising, basically, or electoral organising. And you said to me, I'm interested in doing that as well. And so then you and I got our shit together and headed over to the States in early 2013 on basically a fact-finding mission, and we were in Boston, New York, DC, Chicago. And I often reflect on that trip and as a trip that was incredibly both mind-blowing in terms of discovery, but also overwhelming in terms of the things that we were learning. I've still got the Moleskine journal that I was Jotter book that I wrote furiously in all of these meetings that we're having with people from the DNC and from Obama for America and Emily's List and unions and, you name it, right? But it was the genesis of the Victorian Field Program. By that is the Community Action Network and Labor's, direct voter contact program, which up until that point we did not do. It's funny now because it's over 10 years ago, and I have to keep on reminding folks that have just started to get involved in the party that we never knocked on doors before 2013. Right, that was rare. We didn't phone bank before 2013, right across the country. But I want to get your memories from that trip. And was it as important for you as it was perhaps for me? I'm just interested in your reflections on that, because we met with some serious hitters.
No, we did. It was, in retrospect, kind of insane that all of those people agreed to, you or I were just kind of like cold emailing people being, hi, we're from Australia. Can we come and talk to you about campaigning? And everyone was like, yeah, absolutely. Let's have a coffee or a drink or come to our office or whatever it might be. Which, Americans are good like that, right? They're always happy to have a chat about this stuff, which I didn't know because before that trip I'd never been to the States. That had a huge influence on me and obviously, what you're able to do with the field program, but it also changed the way we worked in the leader's office as well. I think obviously, there's some very formative cultural experiences that I should acknowledge, which, you took me to my first ever dive bar, very exciting. We went to see the Celtics at TD Garden, which was also very exciting, that sort of stuff. But no, the serious part of that was that, all these people who, they're all campaign professionals because, the American system is big enough to support like a whole ecosystem of people who do that for a living. And I remember one of them who had been a, senior aide to, I think President Clinton and then to Obama said to us, because we said, like, how did you change or like what drove all this change? And she said, we got sick of losing. And they'd gone through, the 8 years of the Bush administration just getting, smashed basically. And that basically enough of them had decided that they'd had enough of that and that they were going to have to change things if they wanted to win. And I remember, when we got back being even before we got back being just so convinced that we could change the party. And that we had to if we wanted, because we wanted to do this crazy thing. Like no one had ever won in one term in Victoria. So if we wanted to do that, then we had to do things differently. And, I guess one of the things I had, like I hadn't been in the party that long. I didn't have, 25 years of campaign orthodoxy behind me. So I'm sure a bunch of people thought that was, I was an upstart. So fair enough. But it also meant that when people put new ideas out and showed us that they worked, you and I were both like, well, let's do that. Why don't we do that? And you brought back, the field program and through probably one of the more unparalleled feats of reform in Labor Party history, managed to get it up and running and embed it. And that was, in my view, one of the key reasons we won in 2014. But the part that I kind of took back into my crew was probably digital, was probably the biggest part of that. And the fact that everybody knows what Obama did and that was at the time, pretty groundbreaking, and the way they were using email and the way they were targeting stuff. The social media content was all different. They took their web design and the functionality of their websites to a whole new level, which, again, 10 years later, this all sounds like kind of dinosaur stuff, right? But at the time, it was absolutely cutting edge. You can use data to drive things. And, we came back to a party. You and I had a bunch of these conversations thinking, well, we've got a party right now and a bunch of MPs and candidates who think that direct mail is the way they're going to win this election. And we were convinced that was not going to be enough, and we had to do things differently. And it was a challenge, and it was a long 2 years of persuasion internally to get those things to change. And we didn't win everything, but I think we did enough.
We did, and we won in 2014. And where I want to take the conversation now is a bit more sort of contemporary in terms of some of your reflections now looking back on the years that you were the Chief of Staff in the Andrews government. And starting with getting your reflections on a book, US-based political journalist and I guess writer Ezra Klein has co-authored a book titled Abundance. And this book examines the reasons behind, the lack of progress on ambitious projects in the United States, including affordable housing, infrastructure and renewables. And the thesis behind it broadly is that red tape in US cities, in particular in blue states, so democratic states, as in the Democratic Party, is halting progress in these particular areas. And even it started to reverberate in the echo chamber of federal politics here in Australia, because we've heard Claire O'Neill and even Treasurer Jim Chalmers share some of the sentiments in regards to things like how building of new homes here in Australia and the red tape that exists, and we need to get rid of that so we can build more homes. So I feel like right now everyone in Australian politics is talking about abundance.
Yeah, so look, I mean, it is interesting that everyone is all on about it at the moment. Some of these things come along and they kind of have their zeitgeisty moment, I guess. Like I have read it and I've listened to Ezra Klein talk about it a bit and feel a bit bad for Derek Thompson, who's the other guy who wrote the other half of the book. But
Poor Derek.
That's all right. He narrated half the audiobook. I think that's exactly what you said is right. Reading it is, I think it's clear, it's not written for us. It's written for the American left. But for the first half of the book, which is, as you say, really about, transport, housing, other infrastructure, the thrust of it really is saying, the role of governments is to do stuff. You are elected to do stuff. And, I would kind of hope that everybody, particularly in the Labor Party in this country, would be already thoroughly of that view. If not, the defence of the status quo or the rolling back of progress, that is the Conservative project. It is not ours. And if you're a progressive or on the centre left or however you want to describe it, if you're a social democrat in this country, then you are not satisfied with the status quo. By definition, you are looking for change and want to see change in, a whole variety of things, because you want, we have this belief that the world can and should be better than it is, and that we keep working for that, and it's incremental, but you keep going. And I think that, one of the things the book talks about is that the American left have basically, in trying to protect people from corporate overreach, and in trying to make things better, whether it's, clean air or clean water or, whatever it might be, that they've over-regulated and they've choked things to the point where government's just in the way of a lot of things. And then on the right, you've got a whole bunch of people who they basically want the government to disappear completely. And that neither of those extremes is actually the way you get anything done. I don't think that there are no lessons out of that book for people here in Australia, but I think I think particularly state Labor governments, and, call me biased, but I think definitely the Victorian Labor government that we have now and have had, but in other states as well, that's the job. You build the infrastructure that you need and you deliver the services that people need, that you don't just, as Daniel's very fond of saying, you don't occupy the office for its own sake. That is not what we are here for. So I think, if it's sparking conversations about the fact that government should do things, that in and of itself is not a bad thing. But I genuinely hope that is not a revelation to anyone in the ALP.
So what does this mean, though, for the social democratic mission? And I'm talking more globally here, because when I was in Europe a couple of years ago doing some work, and I was meeting with some social democrats of a particular party in a particular country I won't name, and I was talking about the Victorian Labor experience, and we were talking about policy and ideas and framing and whatnot, even though that's not my area of expertise, but the conversations came up. And I told them about the Andrews government, and I told them about what we campaigned on and then what we governed on. And I mentioned jobs and I mentioned infrastructure. And I got pushback in the room from a social democrat who said, that's a conservative frame and we shouldn't be doing that.
Really?
And I was stunned.
Wow.
What are your thoughts about that?
What did they think was what did they think was the progressive frame? Social policy.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
Yep. And I kind of said to them, took me an hour and a half to get here today on your shit public transport. Wouldn't mind you fixing that for a start, and that's going to create a bunch of jobs and probably make a whole bunch of voters pretty happy as well, because I reckon if they had the same experience that I did, then they'd be displeased. And I don't hear anyone else talking about it, you know?
Yeah.
I found that fascinating. It was enlightening for me. And I do think that there are some folks that have that attitude here in Australia and the party as well. I don't think we should just look at the Europeans and go, you're getting it so wrong. Because if we're not careful, that can creep into the conversation here as well.
No, absolutely. Yeah, look, I think that's right. And I think one of the things that we were very conscious of, and Daniel was always very clear about this as well, is that you will only get license to make social change if you have covered off kind of and I don't say the basics in a sort of to diminish them, but people have basic fundamental expectations of their governments, and at every level, local, state, federal, whatever it may be. And if the governments are not fulfilling their basic purpose, then people are not going to let you or be happy if you're then going off and doing a bunch of other things. So it's not to say that, social policy change is not important. It's incredibly important. But if your transport system is cactus, or people can't get in to see a doctor, or your ambulance system's a mess, or like the just basic access to healthcare and education and jobs, like if people can't, people are pretty rational human beings, like the only thing I remember out of my, year 9 psychology class is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think that's kind of pretty applicable to the way we should think about politics. Like if people can't feed their families and aren't, convinced that they can get basic health care, then they're going to be thinking, well, hang on, what is the government doing? And when we're in government, took the view that, you can kind of build up political capital by delivering on the things that we said we would. So, we said we'd fix the TAFE system, and we said we'd, fix the ambulance system. We said we remove level crossings and all these things. And in doing that, we created the social license to do other things, whether that's, voluntary assisted dying or the whole raft of protections for the LGBTIQ plus community. Like those things were important and we did them, but we didn't do them at the expense of doing the other things. Infrastructure and jobs is not a conservative frame. Like they are fundamental responsibilities of the government. And if you're a Labor government, if you're a social democratic government, then they're part of your key responsibilities.
Just talk to me a bit about the first year of the Andrews government, because if delivery, first of all, why is delivery important? And you kind of just touched on it a little bit in your answer there, but then show me what it looks like in terms of what the Andrews government set about doing in that very first year. Why was it critical that in year 1 you're seen to be governing well? Daniel's
a pretty impatient for change kind of guy, and like that culture was set from the beginning, where the first 100 days, it's a bit of a 100 days is a fairly arbitrary kind of number, but basically the first 3 months of any government, begin as you mean to continue, and we. Rather than waiting for the budget, which is sort of 6 months into the term, we fast-tracked funding for all of our big election commitments that we'd released, that year out from the election, level crossings and other stuff, Melbourne Metro. And we fast-tracked that out the door, and partly to, jumpstart things as fast as possible, because, we were like, well, we've got 4 years and we can't get to the end of 4 years and be like the government we just replaced and have not done the things we said we were going to do. But even, and this is like language matters as well, communications matters alongside delivery. And we had like this, typical government, like glossy brochure that we were putting out as part of this 100 days thing. And it had, planning funding for this and that, the other thing. And I remember having this meeting with the public servants who were kind of helping us put it together. And, they were talking about like, what are we going to call it? And it was, there's all these kind of, classic government kind of names, our whatever, our future, that kind of thing. And we said, no, we want to call it getting on with it. Like, that is what we are doing. We are getting on with delivering our promises. And that was all a bit kind of confronting for the public servants, who happily, after us being in government for many years, got used to us calling the budget some version of getting it done every year. Like that kind of, that I guess that signal to everyone that we are not going to waste any of our time here. This is an opportunity. It's precious. We have been sent here to do a job, and like, we are going to get on with it. And that's kind of, that permeated everything we did in that first year. But the thing that opposition had taught us, having had most of our senior staff, not all, but most of our senior staff kind of come through that opposition experience, was we didn't let orthodoxy kind of get in the way of getting things done.
You just touched a little bit on comms as well, and I want to sort of unpack that a little bit more, because not only did the government get shit done, and there must have been a temptation to call one of those papers "Getting Shit Done" or "Motherfuckers on It," that kind of thing.
It was debated on numerous occasions.
Yeah. Well, now that Trump's just dropping F-bombs and S-bombs willy-nilly, I think it's okay.
No, it's a whole different world now. Turns out we could have done it.
Yeah. But so getting it done is huge. Communicating what you're getting done is the next step. And often we see, like, this was the curse of the Gillard government, because they did do good things, but no one knew about it. They were a terrible government in terms of communication. We've also got examples of governments that have done nothing and then had nothing to communicate, or been quite good at doing nothing and then communicating things that makes it look like they're doing things, and people are like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. But you managed to do both, and do both well. Talk to us about the work that went into communicating the purpose of the government and why they were doing and what they were achieving.
I'll say straight up, it helps when, the guy out the front, the Premier, is, the best political communicator in the country. So, appreciate that was a fair head start that we had on things. But the other thing that we had is really a philosophy, and I was always really big on this, is I think there's a temptation sometimes from not just from the public service, but including from the public service, that communication in government is somehow innately political. And so, like, sometimes it is. I'm not going to say that it isn't always, but I also think that, you can have the best set of policies in the world, but if people, constituents, citizens, whatever you want to call them, if they don't know about them, they can't use them or they can't access them. And I think, I have this fundamental belief that if you're going to be the government, then people have a right to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, because you're doing it in their name. Like, we're a democratic outfit. Like, they vote for the government. The government should then do the things that it said it would do, and, whatever else is called for at the time. But you should also, politics is about choices. Governing particularly is about choices. And I think people have a right to understand why you've made them and what the trade-offs are in that and what they get for it. Take free TAFE as an example. Like, yes, it's something that we the Labor Party campaigned on really heavily in that second 2018 election, but also a really important thing for lots of Victorians to be able to access. And if you don't know that TAFE is free and you don't know how you can get access to that and what kind of courses they are, then you're not going to take it up and then, change your skills or get a new job or whatever it might be. Like, I think people have a responsibility to do that. I also think communication is part of, it's storytelling and narrative are actually important to a government and a political party as well, because people's lives are busy. They've got lots of other things on. They don't spend all their time thinking about the government and what it's doing, but you want them to have a broad sense of where we're going and why that's important.
And the importance of always being on message, that was something that I always found, particularly broadly speaking, for the government. You might want to talk about the rules that you had in terms of what portfolio areas you would only be talking about. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but you can. And I'm hoping you can show me some great examples of where Daniel was able to constantly just, no matter how stupid or off track the questions he was getting from the journalists were about something completely different, he could always bring it back to what he wanted to talk about. at that particular moment.
Yeah, he's a master of the pivot. I think, I mean, look, message discipline was a big part of what we practiced and preached, and not everybody loved that all the time internally, obviously. And we had, we had the grid that, jobs, health, education, transport were the core focus of what we talked about in our comms, what we focused on, whether it was online or anywhere else, and that meant that there were certain portfolios that were on grid and there were certain portfolios that were off grid. And nobody liked being off grid, but there was a kind of for the greater good persuasion case that we sort of had to deal with people. And I would say to their great credit, there were a lot of originally shadow ministers and then ministers who, did what held up their end of their non-grid portfolios, which is to say they were doing important work in a place that mattered, but it wasn't what we were wanting to put front and centre of the government's communications plan on any given day.
It's like as if you want to have a really good, like a good championship team knows that there's guys that are going to have to spend time on the bench. And every now and then you're going to get called onto the court and you're going to have to hit 3 or 4, shots, and then you're going to get back on the bench again. It's kind of like that, right? It's like, can you be the best sixth man? Can you be like Peyton Pritchard, And
an analogy they may be a little bit fonder of is it's important to have a strong defense as much as it is a good offense.
Yeah, right.
You need people at fullback who are going to make sure that things aren't getting out of control in the portfolios or the issues that are not perhaps our strong suits, but need to be really well managed. That was certainly part of it. But I think the other principle of communication, this is a bit trite to say, but people are busy and they don't have time to, in their own normal lives, they're raising kids and working and trying to, look after parents and do all sorts of other things. They don't have time to, study the government's, communications and their policies in huge detail. That's just not the way the world works.
I thought they were reading the Saturday paper every weekend, cover to cover. Every voter does that. Isn't that what happens? I was certain.
That's right. Everyone reads 5 newspapers. Like, just because that's what happened in my household is not normal. I quickly learned. But the principle being, like, if you have a message, you should give the same message everywhere, all the time, to everyone. And that is, and you can nuance it for the platform you're on or the specific part of the audience you're talking to. But if you layer the same kind of comms everywhere you're going, then it will eventually cut through. And it's it's the vomit principle. You say this, when you're sick of giving your message is when people are only just starting to tune into it. And so, that matters. I mean, the other thing is if you're off, spraying around in every issue under the sun, which is actually what prompted the grid to be put together when we were in opposition originally. Because when you're in opposition, you just, you're having a crack about everything you can possibly find. And if you're the last line in, an article in The Age, then, you beauty, you've kind of kicked the goal for the day. But we decided if we wanted to actually cut through and make an impact, we had to narrow the number of things we were talking about. And it's not that different in government, even though you've got a much bigger microphone then and a much bigger set of platforms. And, the media and others will report on everything you say. But if people think that, you're focused and you can show them that you're focused on the things that you said were important because that's what they told you were important, then, as long as you've delivered, more often than not, they'll give you another go.
Can we talk about the fragility of progressive government? So what happens when purpose and delivery drop off from our government that's been around for a while?
I think you can lose momentum really quickly. And I think, and I say this from the other side of the world, acknowledge, but you look at what's happening to the UK Labor government at the moment, and they ran, relatively small target strategy to get into government a year or so ago, and they're really struggling now. I mean, they won the election, so full credit. The campaign worked. I'm not in any way taking away from that. But they didn't seek a big mandate for changes they wanted to make, and they've got into government, and now they're having to try and work out what that looks like and what they're doing with it. And they're having trouble both selling what they're doing to the public, but they're having trouble holding that narrative internally as well. Like, they've just had a whole bunch of people, revolt on welfare reforms. I think part of what they're struggling with is that there wasn't a mandate given at that election for some big set of progressive changes, because they didn't put one up. They didn't put a big set of progressive changes up. So they can't then, say, like, one of the things we were able to say and did often is, this is an election commitment and we are delivering it. And I think, the US, the Democrats have got themselves stuck in that a lot as well. I think that becomes really dangerous, because if the government's not working for people, people won't back the government.
Do you think that the federal Albanese government, the last term, had a bit of that, a bit of lack of purpose, do you think that they were a proactive or a reactive government?
I think that they were a largely reactive government. I think we got into government federally on a relatively tight platform, and I think I said earlier that sometimes we overcorrect on lessons. And I think what happened when we didn't win in 2019, and Bill Shorten took a really big agenda to the election and didn't get over the line. I think we probably, my view, we overcorrected a bit too much the other way on the small target, but it worked, and just as with UK Labor, it worked. We won, and then I think it got difficult though, because like the Voice was a big swing and it was a big miss. I don't think the government took a lot of other big swings after that. People who work in that government may well disagree with that, but I think it got hard, and I think that. They, full credit to them, like an amazing result not long ago with
the election.
Record-breaking election win. But I think an amazing campaign got them along part of the way. I think an amazing negative attack on Peter Dutton as the opposition leader got them a long way as well. And I think when you've made your opposition basically unelectable, then people land back with you, which is not to say that nothing that the government did was good. They did plenty of good things, but I don't think they put out the big vision. And I think they're showing signs this term that they're much more, well, hopefully they're more interested in kind of crafting what that looks like in a second term. But yeah, I think it's easy to get lost, and if something big that is unforeseen lands on you, which it can do out of nowhere, and knock you completely off course, if you don't have kind of a mandate and an agenda to kind of fall back on, then it can get really tough.
Daniel, when he was on the podcast one of the times, said that he plays the year or the years in between elections like a hole in golf. The pin or the green is the last year, or it is the election year.
Yep.
And 4 years out is you on the tee. And he said, I work backwards. Like in golf, I work backwards from the green where I need to get the ball in each of those shots. And so therefore, in his mind, he knows where he wants to be. Basically, he knows where he wants to be in the final year of the election cycle. And that makes perfect sense to me as an organizer, because that's how we strategize, right? And we work out what is our strategic goal, and then what are the steps. I strategize backwards. What do we want to look like? Where does our volunteer capacity need to be 12 weeks out, and then 2 months out, 4 months out, 8 months out, 12 months out. So therefore, where do we start? And I just wonder about other governments. Oh, first of all, does that resonate with you? And then looking at other governments, sometimes I'm like, I don't think you know where you want to be 12 months out, let alone the rest of us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yes, that was always, Daniel's always said to us, like, we got to know where the winning post is, like, where's the finish, and then work backwards from there. Which again makes complete sense to me as well. Although I've been fascinated to find, like you, that's not how all political parties or governments kind of work. And I've also been super interested in the last year and a half I've spent in the private sector. It's not how a lot of businesses work either, which I find in many cases wildly illogical. Like, where do you want to be? Where are you now? How are we going to get from point A to point B? Yep. It doesn't feel like rocket science, but it's actually it's strategic clarity, really. Yep. And that's something that, I think our government had a lot of. Daniel certainly had a lot of, and that was that was how we tried to operate. Not that, things didn't go wrong along the way, or we didn't make mistakes sometimes or miss things. Obviously we did. Everybody does. But yeah, like, you've got to know, I think we framed that up for ourselves really as people have elected us for 4 years, not for 10 or for 2 or any other random number. It's 4 years. And so you promise them on day one you're going to do this, which means by the time you get to the last day of that 4-year period, like, they're entitled to check your homework and say, well, did you do those things? And that's, where are we? We've got to be able to show progress and all that stuff, because if we don't, then they're going to say, well, why you? Maybe we'll give somebody else a go.
So if I can continue with this golf analogy, you may know how you want to play those shots, but then you play those shots and then one of them ends up in the bunker, a pretty big bunker that you didn't predict because you didn't see that bunker behind that tree. It's called COVID. Mm-hmm. So COVID comes along, and it is the government had, what I've found interesting in terms of crisis response for the government, the things that you can't control and how do you react to that. It's, it's such a critical part of leadership. Marshall Gans talks about leadership is about enabling others to achieve shared purpose, but under conditions of uncertainty. We are always operating under conditions of uncertainty. COVID was an exemplar of a condition of uncertainty. And I want to just re-quote to you something that Eric Locke, former State Secretary of the Labor Party, had said on a podcast that he was on with myself and David Feeney. They came on the week after the 60 Minutes report into branch stacking by then Labor Minister Adam Somyurek. Remember, it had hidden cameras, the works, people allegedly forging signatures, all of that kind of stuff. It was huge viewing. It was an incredibly damaging story to both the Victorian Party and to the Victorian government. Branch stacking, for those people who aren't familiar with what that is, it is where people are recruited into joining a branch of the Australian Labor Party, but someone is paying for their membership. So they're not willingly joining the party out of their own volition, but they're basically being stacked. And normally it had happened through ethnic communities like, the Turkish community or the Assyrian community or what you name it. It's been going on for a long, long time, and certainly in Victorian Labor Party politics. That's what branch stacking is. And there's rules against it. Anyway, so at the time, Eric said we recorded the show like on the Thursday after Daniel stood up on the Monday morning after 60 Minutes. And he said of Daniel's handling of it, he said, in a crisis, most politicians can't get away from the crisis quick enough. They just run in the other direction. And he says, Daniel sees a crisis and he runs at it with gusto and jumps on it. Is that an accurate description of Daniel's leadership and his crisis management?
Yes, I generally agree with Eric's analysis. I don't know that I'd go with gusto per se. And as one of the people who had for a long time, the great honour of being the one who would walk into his office, shut the door and say, anyway, this has happened. The initial reaction wasn't usually one of like, terrific, let's go. But as you can imagine, given all manner of things we had to deal with. But what I will say is that Daniel's not ever someone who spent a lot of time saying, well, woe is us, we've been dealt this terrible hand about this thing that, we didn't do and now we have to deal with it. Like, he just didn't waste time on that. He was like, right, well, that's what's happened. So then he was basically straight into, so what are we going to do about it? And I think that if you're in, part of being a leader in a crisis, and I think we had plenty of political crises and all that sort of thing, but the real ones, natural disasters, pandemic, terrorist attacks, and we had all of those, is leading from the front. And I think Daniel's always been like just acutely clear that you have to show up, and because people needed to see him and they needed to know what was going on and they needed to know what we were going to do about it, and ultimately they needed to know it was going to be okay, and that if we all feel like we're part of a team and we're part of something, and during the pandemic it was really very Team Victoria, that was something that he kind of galvanised and gathered people around. And built and held a pretty extraordinary amount of social license for, a pretty unbelievable set of circumstances. And, the things that we were asking people to do were unprecedented in any of our lifetimes. And most people did them, like most of the time. And that was enough to get us through. But he always was of the view, like, I'm never going to ask people to work harder than I do, and I'm never going to let people, kind of feel like they have to go and deal with something difficult and I'm off somewhere else. Like, that's just not who he is, and that's not what we did. So he made sure he showed up, and it was our job to make sure he had everything he needed to make sure he could do that.
And show up he did, and he did it every day for however many days. You'll know probably the exact same number. When did you, with those daily press conferences that he did, how many was it in a row, by the way? Lissie, I forgot.
120.
120.
Yeah.
120 days straight. When did you realise, understand the significance of those daily press conferences for the people of Victoria in terms of getting information? And then it became almost a meme in that, what clothes he was wearing that particular day was going to depend on. In fact, there's some answers there you could probably give for folks as well. If that meant anything, the North Face puffer jacket, if that meant good news or bad news. So people were really tuning in. Anecdotally, I'll give you a story while you're thinking about your answer there. I was walking to go get a coffee from the coffee shop in the city where I live. It was one of the only ones that were open, and that was my morning walk. I loved it. And I remember one morning, normally I tried to get the coffee before Daniel stood up, but I got way late for something. And I'm walking down the alleyway to the coffee shop, which had a back door, and there was a chef that obviously were cooking food that was, being sent out to, for Uber Eats and stuff. And he was having a dart sitting on the step at the back of the restaurant with his phone in his hand. And he yelled out to the guys inside who were obviously about to take their smoko. The press conference is about to start, so to come and watch it. Like, they were watching it on their breaks. And in that moment, I was like, shit, everyone's watching this. I mean, I heard it anecdotally, like, my, family and friends, they were watching it. But like in that moment, I was like, wow, everyone's watching this every day. This is significant in its importance for the people of Victoria, or certainly Melburnians, about when we're getting out of the next lockdown. So just tell us a bit about those press conferences.
Yeah, probably the highest ratings anyone's ever got at 11 o'clock in the morning, I suspect. Look, nobody knew what that was all going to become, and nobody knew how long it was going to go for, or how hard it was going to be, or any of those things at the beginning. But I think we'd made a decision, and I remember saying to our senior staff at the beginning of that whole chapter, I guess, like, we are not going to make political decisions in this. Like, we are putting the politics aside, and we're going to make decisions based on the health advice, because if we do anything else, we're just going to be making it up. And, in a 1 in 100 year event, there's enough making it up as you go along as there is, because there's no rule book. And nobody's kind of done the academic study that we can all kind of follow along with whatever we're supposed to do. So we kind of put the politics aside in that sense. But, the decision to stand up every day and to keep doing it, like, it was Daniel's. And he, like I talked about before, like, he has this acute sense of, I guess, responsibility and accountability that, you've got to be out the front of these things. And he was like, well, if I'm going to be asking people, if I'm going to ask Victorians and Melburnians to do these things, then I have to show up every day and tell them, what we're doing and why we're doing it and how it's going, and be there. And, I didn't have probably as, I did obviously a different experience from a lot of people, because we were working all through that, like around the clock to, support all that work. And, the press conference was kind of the most obvious outward manifestation of what the government was doing and the communication of it. But the response was around the clock. Like, if we got 4 hours sleep a night, we were doing pretty well. And we'd have, like those crisis cabinet, meetings would happen during that kind of July, August period. They were happening nearly every day, sometimes twice a day. You get the advice in from the health, the chief health officers and the departments, and, they'd say, this is where the cases are. This is where, this is what we need to do. And then there'd be kind of the operationalizing of, the other departments trying to work out how that was going to affect businesses and, the logistics of how we're going to test people and how we're going to get food to people who are in quarantine and, all the kind of basics of those things that like nobody had ever had to think about at that large scale before. But in practice, what that meant was, you'd work all day on like the press conference had happened, then you'd work kind of for the rest of the day on whatever needed to be done for the next day, getting ready for decisions that had to be made at the crisis cabinet meeting that afternoon or that evening. They were often very late in the day because particularly early on, like the data was, late coming in because, the systems weren't set up to deal with these things. So you'd have these late meetings and, Premier and ministers and senior officials, giving all these briefings and making decisions about what needed to happen. And then, we'd get off these meetings at whatever time at night. And then that was when the staff in the private offices kind of had to kick into gear again. And, Jessie McCrone, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff, and I would, we would be tasking advisors in our teams at, 10 o'clock at night saying this is all the stuff that has to be ready because, that's what the press, like that's what we have to be able to tell people. Daniel has to be able to stand up in front of people at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock tomorrow morning and say this is the next thing that's happening. So they had to turn around, that information, though they needed, what are the, literally what are the scripts that they need to talk about, what's the data that's got to go into the scripts, how are restrictions working or, whatever the other thing we were doing. So, we had staff working, till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, later sometimes, nearly every day, nearly every night. Trying to turn these things around. Obviously, a whole raft of public servants and other people doing that as well. And that's, and then we'd get into pre-brief in the morning, Daniel, the Cho, the health minister, whoever else was, police commissioner, others are standing up at different points with different messages and getting them briefed on all the data. We'd have to tell them how many cases there were, how many people had died. Like that became part of what, Daniel and I had to talk about every night was how many people had died that day. Everybody had a terrible time during COVID. I'm not going to say that, we were special in that sense, but that relentless pace of just having to keep going. And I think one of the things that I learned out of that, and, a lot of people ask like, well, how did Daniel keep going through all of that and how did the rest of the team? And the genuine answer to that is, well, what other choice is there? Like, if not us, then who? And the answer is no one. So you kind of find the other gear that you didn't know you had and you just keep going, no matter how hard it gets. He did like 120 press conferences in a row. No one's ever done that before. It's 4 months every day. And if I was getting 4 hours of sleep a night, I reckon he was probably getting less. But that's what it took. And that's what people needed. And as you know, the story you just told exactly that. Like there's little kids who, would never have known who the Premier was normally, but they watched Daniel every morning, so they knew who he was. And so people had this kind of really, if you take a step back, a really interesting kind of much more personal relationship with him than you would with a normal kind of Premier in a normal world. And the fact that everyone was like, what's he going to wear today and what does that mean? And the answer, unfortunately, generally is it kind of, I'm not sure it meant anything. It was kind of whatever he grabbed that morning, I think. Some days you feel up to putting the suit on and some days you probably don't. But yeah, it was an amazing time. It was an incredibly difficult time. And I think everybody did the best they could in unbelievably difficult circumstances. But I think that sense of being able to say to people, we are doing this together, I think that was the biggest difference between what was happening in the way we talked about things in Victoria and how we talked about them in other states.
How could you best summarise the reporting of the COVID crisis by the media at that time?
I say this as someone who grew up, consuming a lot of media. I still do, and has a lot of kind of respect for some of those great media institutions around the world. But I think that in a lot of cases, particularly in Victoria, I read a lot of world news during COVID as well, and I think I can say it happened more here than most places, certainly more than anywhere else in Australia. I think some people in the media forgot what their role was, and I think they got their professional responsibilities confused with their personal feelings about things. and, understand how that can happen. But it was, a difficult time for everybody. But I think fundamentally, the fourth estate has an important role to play in, yes, scrutinising government, but also informing the public about what is happening. And I think that too often, in too many cases, like we should have been scrutinised. We absolutely should have been, because we were doing unprecedented things in unbelievable times. So we should have had scrutiny applied to our decision making and our execution of what we decided we were doing. But I think that too often for too many people became a personal thing, and I don't think that did the readers or the viewers of their platforms a particular service a lot of the time. And I think a lot of Victorians voted with their feet on that stuff. I think that was a view shared probably much more widely than most people would normally have a view about media, because everybody was consuming the same stuff all the time. So everybody was in a position to have an opinion about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it drifted from what it was meant to be doing in some places. Not everybody and not all the time, but too much.
How, leading up to or all throughout that year, I mean, did you ever doubt yourselves? Are we doing the right thing? How's this going to go down with the people of the state? Because a lot of the commentary was, this is politically suicidal by the government, the way that they're operating. Daniel Andrews is out of touch with the people of Victoria, and we as the fourth estate know better about what works well with the people and what doesn't, and this is going to be an unmitigated disaster. Did you feel pressure in that time going, are we fucking this up?
I mean, I'm not going to say I never kind of in any point in the 2 years thought, God, how's this all going to go? It didn't ever stop being the right thing to do, though, and I think, and I think Daniel said this to me more than once, the election will be whatever it will be, but that's a later thing, and you've got to deal with the problem in front of you, and the problem in front of us was the pandemic. And if we started fighting the pandemic based on how we wanted people to vote at the end of 2022, that would have been a complete disaster, because we would have made a bunch of the decisions would have been wrong, and people would have got hurt with that, and that was not what we were. That was not what we were about. But I think that poll that you talked about, I'm not going to say when it came out.
Let me
pretty big.
Yeah. Let me go. Let me just read out the numbers. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Go.
So Friday night, we're at a restaurant. We've finished our dinner. The poll comes out at 11 o'clock. We've had entree, mains, desserts.
Yeah.
We should be leaving the restaurant. The poll comes out. Labor primary, 44. Remember, we got a 42.9 at the 2018 election. 44 Labor primary, 36 coalition. Two-party preferred, Labor, 58. Coalition, 42. Daniel Andrews' performance in handling COVID. Overall, well, 60. Paulie, 39. Don't know 1% of the entire sample didn't have an opinion on Daniel Andrews. That is remarkable. Better Premier, 54. Satisfied with the job, performance, 56. Dissatisfied, 42. When that poll came out, and it was the first one in a long time, and I sat opposite my partner, who obviously is working in the government as well, and it wasn't a sigh of relief, but it was almost like a sort of satisfaction or vindication or kind of, fuck you. And we ordered a bottle of champagne. I said, no, you've worked too hard for this. I know it's not the election and we're 12 months out from the poll. Incidentally, that's basically what happened on election day anyway. This poll of 12 months out was a replication of what actually happened, in which we increased our majority. But I felt like I was a sports fan because I wasn't working for the party anymore. I was just now doing my own thing. And I remember I felt like I was cheering from the sidelines. I was like, fucking oath. Fucking all of you pricks have got this wrong for so fucking long. You have doubted this person, and you are, you're supposed to be the experts on this shit, but you don't know shit. You're just so wrong. You are so wrong. And this poll is such a vindication for the decisions you made. And that's the feelings I felt. And I'm not the one getting 4 hours sleep a night during, the whole of this response. And I just want to get your thoughts about when this poll came out. Or was there any moments of satisfaction in terms of, we actually are doing the right thing by the people of Victoria, but also politically this is working?
Yeah, I mean, that was a the other thing I'd maybe add for context around that week is also, I think it was the day before, don't quote me on this, I think it was the day before we hit 90% vaccinated in Victoria, like that week. And I think like that's like you can look at those two data points and like that's kind of, you know, there's 1,000 stories out of the pandemic everywhere and the same for this state. But one of the stories is Victorians fundamentally hung together and decided to do the thing that would be collectively in all of our interests. And that is those are the things that Daniel and the government asked people to do, and they did them. And you can see that because 90% of them got vaccinated in a pretty, you know, unbelievably short period of time. And I think the thing that was, you know, missed by a lot of people in the media, not only the media, there's plenty of, you know, other people out there commentating as well, is that nobody was making these decisions for fun or because we thought that would be, what a great thing to do. They were decisions driven out of necessity. And I think the thing that they missed is that fundamentally most Victorians understood that. And that's why they got tested and why they got vaccinated and why they stayed home and, you know, abided by all the other, you know, things that they were asked to do. So, you know, yes, when the numbers like that came out, yes, I was relieved. Of course I was relieved. And I sadly didn't have a bottle of champagne, although I'm pretty sure I got a photo of the one that you guys were drinking. But yeah, like it was, vindication's not a bad word, I think, for it. But it was just like you got to back your judgment in the end in these things and you've got to believe. And we believed that they were the right things to do for the right reasons and that people would, you know, if people didn't agree with us on that, they wouldn't have been following the rules. If they didn't believe it, they wouldn't be doing it. And in the end, we all believed enough of the time that's, you know, we got through this amazing thing together and did these unbelievable things. But, yeah, you know, you'd always rather be the 58 than the 42.
Absolutely. Okay, campaigns, just quickly, 2014, 2018, 2022, all three big wins for Labor. Do you have a favourite?
Do I have a favourite?
Do you like campaigning?
No. I liked campaigning in opposition. I did not enjoy particularly any of those three election campaigns, which I know that sounds weird and probably anathema to a lot of my friends and comrades, but I don't know. I think for me, like there's just the way I think, like it's just there's everything on the line. Like you win everything or you lose everything. There's no, there's no middle ground in these things in our system, and you know, like it's all kind of in the lap of the gods at that point. Like you can't, you know, I think you don't have enough things you can do to control the outcome in an individual sense at that point. So no, I've never enjoyed any of them, particularly in the moment. I enjoyed winning all of them. Especially after, I talked about like that, like understanding what it feels like to lose. Like you can never properly convey what it feels like to win. But all those three were different. Like 14 was a vindication that we'd done something no one said. You know, everyone said we couldn't win in one, and we did. And we pulled that off, and we were a scrappy little outfit that didn't have, a huge army behind us, and they had more money than we did, and we did it anyway. And then 18 was, this thing that was like, well, it wasn't a fluke. And we can keep doing the things that we want to do, that we want to change the state with. And then 22 was relief, to be honest, that much like that poll a year earlier, that people had stuck with us. We'd put this big agenda forward, and we'd had to do these crazy things during the pandemic and lock people in their homes for 2 years. And they basically said, no, we understand why that happened, and we want you to stay.
Most challenging day on the job and most rewarding day on the job?
The obvious answers on the, pandemic and natural disasters and all those sorts of things. But maybe to give something a little bit earlier in the piece that's maybe a little bit more interesting, probably both bookends. I'll bookend this thing with hardest and best. So what has become known as Skyrail, but was originally the Caulfield to Dandenong level crossing removal project, which was 9 of the 50 level crossings that we said would remove in the first term between Caulfield and Dandenong, were in 3 kind of batches along the line. And we had two options for how they were going to be removed. And the obvious way that always been done was you dig these dirty, great trenches in the ground, and you drop the rail line, and it just kind of sits there in this huge trench, and it takes up all this space, and people can drive straight across, and the crossing's gone, but it's not a great, always an ideal kind of outcome for the community anyway. But they gave us an alternative for this one, which was that the rail goes up. And I still remember being shown what that would look like the first time and thinking that would be, particularly for part of this area, which has some of the lowest amount of open space anywhere in Victoria, imagine what we could do under there if you can get the rail up and then you can put anything underneath. But no one had ever done it before. So it was this, like, now Skyrail's everywhere in Melbourne and everyone's like, how great. But at the time we hadn't done it before. And so it was this huge calculated political risk that we backed ourselves to say, no, this is the right outcome. This is going to be a better outcome for the community. And, Daniel was one of the local members along that line. So he took on a bunch of that personal risk along with the others. But we then had to, there were a couple of years between that starting and it finishing. So that was 2 years of relentless. Sorry, this is all pre-pandemic, relative relentless, the thresholds change for these things. But that was 2 years of absolutely ferocious media attack about the whole thing, the opposition campaigning against it, a lot of really vocal community opposition, and full credit to, Steve Dimopoulos and others who stood their ground on the ground. In fact, despite the fact they were getting, threats and all kinds of other things. And that was, I remember saying after we'd made that decision and announced it and it was getting rocky, I remember saying to my partner, because I'd backed this really hard in the advice we were putting up, saying, God, I hope this goes well, because if it doesn't, I reckon I'm going to have to resign, which all sounds very dramatic now, but at the time that's how big it felt. And then when it finished, and, I was out there coincidentally on the weekend having lunch with a couple of people right next to the tracks in Murrumbina, and there's bike paths under it and heaps of car parking, and, there's basketball courts in other places. And I remember when we got them open and the first reports of people who'd lived in that area saying, I didn't support this. I thought it was going to be terrible, but I look at it now and I just think this is amazing, and I'm really glad that it got done. And that's, it seems, there's lots of other things the government's done that I'm proud of. But I think the thing that taught me and taught a whole bunch of us was, if you really think something is the right thing, then you got to build the case for it, but you've got to stick it out as well.
I think we've done our hour. We're probably going a little bit over our hour today, Lissie, but I wanted to keep going because I have really wanted to have you on the show for a number of years. So take these opportunities when you get them, because I don't know if you'll ever do another podcast, but grateful for you to come on the show. Look, and the other thing I wanted to say, and I know that you're a pretty humble kind of person, so you probably won't answer this, but I often wondered when you were in the job that many people, mostly probably men in business and in politics, probably didn't realise how important you were in terms of the success and the influence and the role that you had in the government. Yes, you are a paid staffer. You don't have a public persona. You're not democratically elected. But I'd always heard sort of tidbits of, even male ministers of cabinet probably didn't actually really recognise the significant role that you played in the direction of the government. And I think that's down to a bit of sexism, maybe a bit of ageism as well. And I just wanted to take that opportunity, because this is my own podcast, just to let everyone else know that Lissie was a very, very, very influential person in the government. And I know that they do those business, the AFRs kind of, top 50 most influential people of the year bullshit bloody things. And they wouldn't have even known about you, Lissie, because that's the way you've operated. You don't want folks to know who you are. But God damn it, if they did that during the height of the Andrews government, you should be in the top 5 most influential people in the nation, and I certainly, in terms of campaigners and political minds, you're in my top 5 of all time. You are, I think as Ben Foster says, you are a phenom. I think I'm getting that right. Operator. When you finished up when Daniel retired from public life, we lost one of our best political operators. But obviously, FMRS Advisory are better for it because, you guys got together and are actually doing great work in the private sector for a whole bunch of other different folks. But I just wanted to acknowledge the service that you gave to the Labor Party and to the Labor government and the success of 3 Andrews terms, the election wins and everything else in between, and the way that they've reshaped this state for the better. And that's down to a lot of people, but you played a pretty significant role in that as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and thank you, Lissie. Thank you for your service, as they say in the United States.
Thank you, Stephen. That is very kind of you. I appreciate all of that and the risk of this turning into a mutual admiration society.
Yeah, don't do it. Don't do it.
No, I'm doing right to reply. I think, as we talked about earlier, like that trip we went on to the US and the things that, we learnt there and that we brought back and that, you and I and many others have worked so hard on for, nearly the last 15 years or so in this state. I think we did manage to change the way the party campaigned and we've changed the way governments are run. And I think that's for the better. And it's, took a lot of people to do it and a lot of people to believe in it and a lot of people willing to take some risks. But I think we did a pretty good job overall.
And thank you for coming on the show. And now that you've aired yourself publicly, maybe we can get you back on in the future to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Anything's possible. It was pretty painless so far.
Thanks, Lissie. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Stephen.
Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Special thank you to our 2 new Patreon subscribers, Miles Wachiga and our dear friend of the pod, Michael Cooney. Paid Patreon subscribers get ad-free episodes, plus free dibs on any questions within reason to Jesse, David, and myself for our monthly Feeny Files with Jesse McCrone. So head on over to Patreon and subscribe if you want to join the conversation. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.